Jericho Hollow wasn't much of a town anymore. Most maps didn't bother marking it, and the ones that did often mislabeled it as a ghost town. If you looked at it from the cracked asphalt of Route 89, you might think the maps weren't wrong. The narrow streets were lined with boarded-up houses, their porches sagging like the weary shoulders of old men. The coal mine, once the lifeblood of the town, stood like a rusting skeleton against the gray sky, its conveyor belts hanging limp and broken. The only sounds in Jericho Hollow were the wind whistling through empty windows and the occasional rumble of trucks barreling past on the highway, drivers too focused on their destinations to glance toward the dying town. Life here was thin and brittle, clinging to whatever scraps it could find. The few who remained, less than 50 souls by last count, had their reasons. Some were too stubborn to leave, others couldn't afford to, and a few, the ones who never spoke much and kept their blinds drawn tight even in daylight, had stories they wouldn't share. But the church was different. St. Eustace's stood on the highest hill in town, a hulking figure that loomed over Jericho Hollow like a silent sentinel. Built in 1852, back when the coal mines were rich and men were eager to believe in salvation, it had weathered nearly 2 centuries of storms and neglect. Its white clapboard siding had turned gray with age, and vines curled around its foundations like the fingers of a slow-moving grave. The stained glass windows, imported from Europe at great expense, still caught the light in fractured bursts of crimson and gold. But it was the bell tower that drew the eye. The spire reached high into the sky, its tip crowned by a weathered cross that leaned slightly to the left, as if bowing to the inevitable. The iron bell within the tower was massive, cast in 1845 by a craftsman whose name was now lost to history. Legend said he had poured a little of his own blood into the molten metal, a superstition meant to bind the bell's voice to the spirit of its maker. It hadn't rung in decades, not since 1974, when Father Callahan had left town, taking the congregation with him. For 50 years, the bell was silent, until one night, it wasn't. It started, as these things often do, with a story. Something the children whispered to each other when they gathered by the creek at dusk, or huddled around their bedroom lanterns after dark. They said that if you heard the bell ring at midnight, you were marked. The sound would pull something up from the deep places of the earth, something old and hungry. No one could say what it was exactly. Some called it a demon. Others said it was the ghost of a miner crushed in a cave-in, still searching for the light of day. The older folks dismissed it as nonsense, a scary story meant to pass long, empty nights. But even they never went near the church after sunset. The bell rang for the first time on a Tuesday, a night so black and still that the stars seemed to press down on the town like a shroud. Most folks were in bed by then, lulled into uneasy sleep by the monotony of their days. But when the first deep, resonant peal echoed across Jericho Hollow, people shot upright in their beds. Windows creaked open as pale faces peered into the dark, searching for a sign that they weren't the only ones who heard it. The sound was impossibly loud, carrying all the way to the farthest edges of town. It wasn't the kind of noise you could mistake for something else, like the groan of old timber or the howl of the wind. This was a bell, ancient and deliberate, its tone deep enough to rattle the glass in their window panes. It rang 12 times, each note hanging in the air long after it should have faded. Then, as suddenly as it started, the ringing stopped. The town fell silent again, but the silence felt different now, thicker, heavier, like the air before a thunderstorm. Mary Danvers, who lived in the house closest to the church, swore she saw a shadow moving at the edge of her property that night. She'd been sitting by the window, knitting a scarf and telling herself she wasn't afraid, when the bell's final note faded into the dark. Her first thought was to grab her shotgun, the same one her father had used to ward off wolves when she was a girl. But something held her back. The shadow moved strangely, she said later. Not like a man walking, but like smoke caught in a draft, shifting and curling in ways that didn't make sense. It lingered near the churchyard, then slipped between the tombstones and vanished into the shadows of the bell tower. By morning, everyone in Jericho Hollow had heard about Mary's story. Some dismissed it outright. Others muttered about the old legends, but no one dared go up the hill to see for themselves. Not even Deputy Lane, who was supposed to be the law in town, though his badge was more ceremonial than practical these days. The next night, the bell rang again. This time, people were ready. Curtains were pulled back, just enough for curious eyes to peek through, and flashlights flickered as brave souls ventured onto their porches. The sound was just as loud, just as resonant, and just as wrong. It rang 12 times, each note carrying a weight that made the air hum. That was when the lights began to flicker, not just in one house, but all over town. The bulbs buzzed and dimmed, casting the streets in an eerie, pulsing glow. And then, just as the final note of the bell faded, the power went out completely. Jericho Hollow was plunged into darkness, and in that darkness, something moved. The morning after the second ringing of the bell, the town of Jericho Hollow buzzed with a nervous energy it hadn't known in decades. People spoke in whispers, as if the very air might overhear and carry their words to the wrong ears, or the wrong thing. On Main Street, the Rusty Bucket Diner saw more customers than it had in months. Old-timers nursed their black coffees while exchanging grim looks over the rims of their mugs, and the younger crowd leaned in close to catch every word. Deputy Lane stood by the counter, his uniform rumpled and his eyes rimmed with the red of sleepless nights. "Could be some punk kids," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe snuck in there and got the old thing swinging. Bell like that. Doesn't take much to get it moving, right?" "Swinging? That bell's been rusted in place for 50 years, countered Gus Wheeler, a retired miner with hands like tree roots. "The damn thing weighs near 2 tons. Ain't no kid in this town could budge it, let alone get it ringing." At a corner booth, Mary Danvers sipped her tea with shaking hands, her face pale and drawn. "It's not kids," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you, I saw something. It wasn't human." Gus leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You're saying you saw a ghost?" "No," Mary replied sharply. "I don't know what I saw. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't like any ghost story I've ever heard either. It moved like it wasn't all there. Like it was slipping between here and somewhere else." The room fell silent. Even the clink of silverware on plates seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Deputy Lane cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Look, I'll check it out. Go up there tonight and take a look at the bell tower. It's probably just some animal, or, I don't know, something else. Nothing to be scared of." His voice wavered at the end, betraying his own unease. "You go ahead and do that," Gus muttered, shaking his head. "But don't come crying when you find out it's something you shouldn't have messed with." By the time night fell, Jericho Hollow felt more like a coiled spring than a town. Doors were locked tight, curtains drawn, and lights left burning in every room. The bell hadn't rung yet, but people could feel it coming, like the prickle of static before a lightning strike. Deputy Lane sat in his patrol car at the base of the hill, staring up at St. Eustace's church. He'd brought a flashlight, his revolver, and a thermos of coffee, though none of them made him feel particularly brave. His heart thudded in his chest as he climbed out of the car and started up the gravel path. The crunch of his boots seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The church loomed larger with every step, its bell tower jutting into the starless sky like a jagged tooth. Lane shivered, though the air was warm. He reached the heavy oak doors and pushed them open, the ancient hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the church smelled of mildew and thyme. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he swept it across the pews. The altar stood at the far end, draped in a threadbare cloth that might once have been white. Above it, the stained glass window of St. Eustace shimmered faintly in the dim light. The saint's face cracked and warped. Lane's flashlight flickered, then steadied. He cursed under his breath and turned his attention to the stairs leading up to the bell tower. The wood creaked beneath his weight, and the narrow staircase seemed to stretch on forever, spiraling upward into the dark. When he reached the top, he found himself face to face with the bell. It was even larger than he'd imagined, its surface pitted and scarred with age. The clapper hung in the center, motionless. There were no signs of tampering, no ropes, no tools, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. Lane let out a shaky breath and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "See? Nothing to it," he muttered, though the words rang hollow. He started back down the stairs, his footfalls echoing in the confined space. But halfway down, he stopped. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, somehow, as if the tower itself were holding its breath. And then he heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails on stone. It came from below, near the altar. Lane froze, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he was the law, wasn't he? If he didn't investigate, who would? He descended the stairs slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The scraping grew louder, more frantic. When he reached the bottom, he swept the beam across the pews, the altar, the shadowed corners of the church. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Who's there?" The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the direction of the altar, a low, guttural sound rose, a growl, deep and primal. Lane's flashlight flickered again, and in that brief stutter of light, he saw something move. It was a shape, dark and formless, shifting like smoke, but with a weight that made the floorboards creak. 2 pinpricks of light glowed where its eyes should have been, and when it moved, it did so with a speed that defied logic, flowing like liquid across the floor. Lane stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. He fumbled for his revolver, but before he could draw it, the thing let out a sound, a noise that was neither a roar nor a scream, but something in between. It reverberated through the church, shaking the stained glass and sending a jolt of terror straight to his core. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the thing was gone. The church fell silent once more, but the air still felt charged, as if the walls were holding on to the echo of that terrible sound. Lane didn't wait to see if it would come back. He bolted out the doors, down the hill, and into his patrol car, slamming the door behind him and locking it tight. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys, finally managing to start the engine. He didn't stop driving until he was back in his own driveway, where he sat for hours, staring blankly at the dashboard. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen, not that night, and not the next day. But the bell rang again at midnight, and this time, the sound was different. It was louder, angrier, and it didn't stop at 12 chimes. Jericho Hollow was no stranger to whispers. For decades, the dying town had been filled with quiet rumors and half-told stories. But now, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The third night of the bell brought something that no one could ignore: a disappearance. Old Man Harris had lived in the same house for 70 years, just a stone's throw from the church. He was a fixture in the town, always seen on his porch with a mug of coffee in the morning and a cigarette in the evening. But on the morning after the bell rang out for the third time, his porch was empty. By noon, people began to notice. Harris's nearest neighbor, Maggie Olson, was the first to check on him. She found his front door ajar, the screen door swaying in the breeze. Maggie hesitated, calling out his name a few times before stepping inside. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you want to leave. The air smelled faintly of something burnt, like scorched wood or old firecrackers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, a mug of coffee still steaming faintly beside a plate of uneaten toast. Harris's chair was pushed back, as if he'd stood up suddenly, and his slippers lay abandoned on the floor. Maggie swore she could feel the air in the house move, like something unseen was brushing past her. She didn't stay long. By the time she ran out the door and down the street, her voice was shaking as she yelled for help. It didn't take long for a small crowd to gather outside Harris's house, their nervous murmurs filling the air. But no one dared go inside again. The sheriff, who'd been called out from the next town over, arrived an hour later. Sheriff Cutter was a large man with a bristly mustache and a deep voice that brooked no argument. He listened to Maggie's story with a frown, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the strange smell and the untouched breakfast. "You said the door was open when you got here?" he asked. Maggie nodded. "Just swinging there. I thought maybe he'd stepped out, but nothing. Harris doesn't go anywhere without his cane," Gus Wheeler interrupted, pointing to the worn wooden stick leaning against the wall, just inside the door. "And he sure as hell doesn't leave his coffee behind." Cutter sighed, adjusting his belt as he stepped onto the porch. "All right, I'll take a look." His tone was steady, but his eyes darted to the church on the hill. It loomed in the background, its bell tower casting a shadow that seemed to stretch farther than it should. Inside the house, Cutter found nothing more than Maggie had described at first. But as he moved through the rooms, his gut told him something was wrong. The air felt too heavy, the shadows too deep. He stopped in the hallway outside Harris's bedroom, his hand hovering near the butt of his gun. The burnt smell was stronger here, acrid and choking. Cutter opened the door to the bedroom and froze. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and damp with sweat. On the wall above the headboard was a black smear, like soot or ash, stretching up to the ceiling. It looked almost like a handprint. Cutter swallowed hard and backed out of the room, his boots crunching on something gritty. When he looked down, he saw a faint trail of coal dust leading from the bedroom, through the hall, and out the front door. The story spread like wildfire through Jericho Hollow. By nightfall, everyone knew about Old Man Harris and the coal dust. Some folks said he'd been taken by the thing from the church, the shadowy figure Mary Danvers had seen. Others insisted it was the bell itself, that its ringing had called Harris away, just like the stories warned. Whatever the truth, no one wanted to be outside when the clock struck 12. That night, the town held its collective breath as midnight approached. The air was thick with anticipation, every creak of a floorboard or rustle of leaves setting nerves on edge. Lights burned in every window, though they offered little comfort. The bell rang. This time the sound was deeper, more resonant, as if the bell were calling from a place far below the earth. Each chime reverberated through the town, shaking loose shingles and rattling the glass in windows. It rang 12 times, and then, for the first time, a 13th. The 13th chime was different. It was longer, the note drawn out and trembling, as if the bell itself were straining against something. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the knocking. Mary Danvers was the first to hear it. She sat in her living room, her shotgun resting across her lap, when the sound began, a slow, deliberate rapping at her front door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The knocks came again, louder this time, and she realized they weren't coming from the door at all. They were coming from the window. Her head turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Outside, beyond the lace curtain, she saw it, the shadow. It moved like smoke, curling and twisting against the glass, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Mary screamed, raising the shotgun and firing without thinking. The blast shattered the window, and the shadow dissolved into the night. Across town, others heard the knocking too. At first, it was isolated, just a few scattered reports of strange noises at doors and windows. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The sounds grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside wanted desperately to be let in. In the Johnson household, a young boy named Danny clutched his mother's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom," he whispered, "it's at the back door." She hushed him, her own fear barely concealed. But when she turned to look, she saw the shadow there, sliding up the glass like ink spilled in water. She yanked Danny away and locked them both in the bathroom, the sound of knocking echoing through the house. By dawn, the knocking stopped. But when the people of Jericho Hollow emerged from their homes, they found something waiting for them. Scrawled on walls, doors, and windows was a single word, written in coal dust: "Come." The town held a meeting that morning in the Rusty Bucket Diner. Sheriff Cutter stood at the front, his face pale but determined. "We can't ignore this anymore," he said, his voice steady but low. "Whatever's happening, it's centered on that church. We need to figure out what's going on up there before it takes someone else." Mary Danvers stood, her hands trembling. "It's not the church," she said. "It's the bell. The stories, they're true. The bell's calling something, and it's not going to stop." The room fell silent. Cutter glanced out the window, his gaze fixed on the bell tower in the distance. "We'll go tonight," he said finally. "Me, Gus, and anyone else willing to come. We'll end this." The decision to confront the church didn't sit well with everyone. Most of Jericho Hollow's residents refused to leave their homes after dark, let alone climb the hill to St. Eustace's. But Sheriff Cutter's resolve was unshaken. By dusk, a small group had gathered at the diner to prepare for the night ahead. Alongside Cutter was Gus Wheeler, his face carved with the kind of lines that came from a lifetime in the mines. His old miner's lantern dangled from one hand, and he'd brought a pickaxe slung over his shoulder, just in case. Mary Danvers had insisted on joining too, despite Cutter's protests. She carried her father's ancient hunting rifle, though her hands trembled whenever they strayed near the trigger. Lastly, there was Tom Fletcher, the town's youngest deputy, who looked pale as milk but refused to back out. They didn't talk much as they loaded supplies into Cutter's truck. Words felt fragile, too easily shattered by the weight of what they were about to face. The bell tower loomed above them, shrouded in the first shadows of night. It felt alive somehow, as if it were watching their every move. By the time they reached the church, the moon had risen, casting the hill in a cold silver light. The group stood in the gravel lot, staring up at the ancient structure. Its stone walls were streaked with black, as if charred by fire, and the cracked stained glass window of St. Eustace seemed to glow faintly, though no light came from within. The bell tower jutted into the sky like a skeletal finger, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the ground. "Let's make this quick," Cutter said, breaking the silence. He pulled his flashlight from his belt and started up the steps to the heavy oak doors. Gus stayed close behind, his lantern swinging in his grip. "You think we're gonna find anything in there?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Cutter admitted, "but I'm tired of waiting for it to find us." Mary and Tom followed reluctantly, their eyes darting to the darkened woods surrounding the church. The trees seemed to lean toward the building, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Cutter pushed the doors open with a grunt. The hinges groaned, the sound echoing into the cavernous interior. The air inside was heavy, damp with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust clung to every surface, and the pews were warped and splintered from years of neglect. The altar stood at the far end, draped in the same threadbare cloth, and the faint outline of coal dust could still be seen leading toward the stairs. "Stay close," Cutter ordered, his voice firm. He led the way down the center aisle, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The others followed in single file, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. When they reached the base of the bell tower, Cutter stopped. The narrow staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into the shadows above. He glanced at Gus, who gave him a curt nod, then started up the steps. The wood creaked ominously under their weight, but they pressed on, their breaths shallow and quick. The bell was just as Lane had described it, massive and ancient, its surface scarred with age. The clapper hung motionless in its center, and the rope that once pulled it lay rotted and frayed at the base. But there was something else now, something new. Etched into the bell's surface were strange symbols, jagged and angular, like scratches made by claws. They spiraled around the metal in tight, intricate patterns, glowing faintly with a dull red light. "What the hell is that?" Gus whispered, his voice barely audible. Cutter stepped closer, his flashlight beam catching the edges of the carvings. The symbols seemed to shift under the light, writhing like living things. "Looks like writing," he muttered. Though the words felt inadequate, Mary shuddered. "That's not any kind of writing I've ever seen," she said, gripping her rifle tighter. Tom stood near the edge of the tower, peering out over the town below. "Sheriff," he said, his voice tight, "you'd better take a look at this." Cutter joined him, his heart sinking as he followed Tom's gaze. In the distance, the lights of Jericho Hollow flickered like dying stars, and in the woods beyond the town, shadows moved, hundreds of them, slipping between the trees like smoke. "They're coming," Tom whispered. The group descended the stairs in a rush, their footsteps pounding against the wood. Back in the nave, the air had grown colder, the shadows deeper. The coal dust on the floor seemed to shift as they passed, swirling in faint, unnatural patterns. "What now?" Gus asked, his lantern swinging wildly. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever's out there to get to us." Cutter's mind raced. The bell was the key, he was sure of it. The strange carvings, the sounds it had summoned. It all pointed to the same thing. "We destroy it," he said, his voice firm. "We bring the damn thing down." Gus hesitated, then nodded. "I've got the tools for it, but it's gonna take time." "Then we'd better move fast," Cutter said. He turned to Mary and Tom. "You two keep watch. Let us know if anything comes close." Mary swallowed hard, but nodded. Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at Cutter's face silenced him. Gus worked quickly, setting up a pulley system to lower the bell once it was detached. Cutter helped where he could, his hands steady, despite the growing sense of dread. The carvings on the bell seemed to pulse with a faint rhythmic light, as if responding to their movements. Outside, the shadows drew closer. Mary stood by the door, her rifle aimed at the tree line, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Sheriff," she called, her voice shaking. "They're almost here." Tom stood beside her, his revolver drawn. He flinched as the first shadow emerged from the woods, its form shifting and twisting like black smoke. It moved with an unnatural speed, flowing across the ground toward the church. "They're coming," Mary yelled, firing a shot into the dark. The bullet passed through the shadow harmlessly, striking a tree behind it. The thing didn't slow. Inside the tower, Cutter and Gus worked frantically. The bolts holding the bell in place were ancient, rusted, and stubborn, but Gus attacked them with the precision of a man who had spent his life breaking through stone. The first bolt gave way with a sharp crack, then the second. The shadows were at the door now, pressing against the wood with a force that made it groan. Mary fired again, her hands shaking. Tom joined her, his shots equally ineffective. The door buckled, splinters flying as the things outside pushed harder. "One more!" Gus shouted, his voice strained. He swung his pickaxe with all his strength, the final bolt snapping free. The bell shifted, its massive weight straining against the pulley. "Now!" Cutter yelled. Gus released the rope, and the bell fell, crashing down the tower with a deafening roar. It struck the ground with a force that shook the church, shattering into 1,000 pieces. The sound that followed was unlike anything they'd ever heard. A high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows at the door recoiled, writhing and twisting as if in pain. One by one, they dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the cold night air behind. When the dust settled, the group stood in silence, staring at the broken remains of the bell. The carvings were gone, the glowing light extinguished. "It's over," Cutter said, though the words felt hollow. But deep in the ruins of the bell, something moved. A faint, pulsing light that flickered once before vanishing. The silence in the church after the bell's destruction was deafening. The once echoing nave now felt hollow, as if the bell had taken something intangible with it, something that had once tethered the building to the earth. But for the four who stood amidst the wreckage, relief was fleeting. They'd stopped the bell, but the feeling that they were far from safe pressed down on them like a lead weight. Sheriff Cutter wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand trembling as he surveyed the shattered remains of the bell. The metallic shards were scattered across the stone floor, some still faintly warm to the touch. Gus Wheeler stood beside him, his breathing ragged, hands gripping the pickaxe so tightly, his knuckles were white. "Did we do it?" Mary Danvers whispered from the doorway, her voice quivering. She kept her rifle trained on the threshold, though the shadowy forms that had threatened them were now gone. "It sure as hell feels like we did something," Cutter said, his voice rough. He knelt down, inspecting one of the larger pieces of the bell. The strange carvings that had glowed so fiercely only minutes ago were now dull, almost invisible, as if the metal itself was dead. "But I'm not sure it's over." From the corner of the room, Tom Fletcher spoke up, his voice strained with uncertainty. "Sheriff, there's still something here. Can't you feel it?" Cutter looked up sharply. He could feel it too, the way the air seemed thicker now, charged with an unseen energy. It wasn't the oppressive darkness from before, but something more insidious, a quiet, watchful presence. When they stepped outside, the chill of the night hit them like a slap. The trees surrounding the church swayed in a wind that hadn't been there moments before, their branches scraping against one another in a hollow, mournful cadence. The moon, so bright when they'd arrived, was now shrouded in thin gray clouds that moved unnaturally fast across the sky. "We should get back to town," Cutter said, motioning for the others to follow. "No sense hanging around here any longer." Mary didn't need to be told twice. She clutched her rifle tightly and began descending the steps, her eyes darting to every shadow. Tom stayed close behind, his revolver drawn, though he looked as if he might drop it at any moment. Gus hesitated at the top of the steps, glancing back toward the bell tower. "You think it's really gone?" he asked. "The thing we saw? The one that came from the mines?" Cutter didn't answer right away. He followed Gus's gaze to the tower, its outline stark against the swirling clouds. "I think it's hurt," he said finally. "But gone?" "Number not yet." The truck ride back to Jericho Hollow was tense, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old vehicle's frame. The group didn't speak much, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Cutter kept one hand on the wheel, his other gripping his flashlight like a talisman. Mary sat beside him, staring out the window with unblinking eyes, while Gus and Tom huddled in the truck bed, their breath fogging in the cold air. When they reached the town square, it was eerily quiet. The houses were dark, their windows shuttered and doors locked tight. Even the Rusty Bucket Diner, which was usually a refuge for late-night stragglers, was closed. It felt as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they climbed out of the truck, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Maggie Olson, her face pale and drawn. She ran toward them, her breath hitching as she spoke. "Sheriff, it's Harris," she said, her voice trembling. "He's back." They found Old Man Harris sitting on his front porch, exactly where he'd been the night he disappeared. His head was bowed, his hands resting limply on his knees. His cane leaned against the porch railing, untouched. "Harris?" Cutter called out as he approached cautiously. The old man didn't respond. Gus followed close behind, his lantern casting flickering shadows over the porch. "Harris, it's Gus. You all right?" Slowly, Harris raised his head. His eyes were dull, glassy, as if he were looking straight through them. His face was gaunt, his skin ashen, and there were dark streaks smeared across his clothes, coal dust, thick and oily. "They rang it again," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They rang it, and I answered." Cutter felt a chill run down his spine. He knelt in front of Harris, trying to meet his vacant gaze. "Who rang it? What happened to you?" Harris blinked slowly, as if processing the questions was an insurmountable effort. "The bell. It called me," he said. "Pulled me down, into the dark. I couldn't fight it. And now, they're coming." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mary stepped back, her rifle trembling in her hands. "What does he mean, they're coming?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. "I thought we stopped it." "We did," Cutter said, though even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. "We broke the bell. It shouldn't be able to call anyone anymore." "But it did," Harris rasped, his voice gaining a sudden eerie strength. "The bell's just the start. It's what woke them, but it's not what keeps them here. They're hungry, and they won't stop until they've taken us all." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It was faint at first, like the rumble of distant thunder, but it quickly grew stronger. The sound of cracking wood and shifting earth echoed through the town, and a low, guttural roar rose from somewhere deep below. "Get inside," Cutter shouted, grabbing Harris by the arm and pulling him to his feet. The group rushed into Harris's house, slamming the door behind them. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they huddled in the dimly lit living room, the lantern casting jittery shadows on the walls. "What the hell is happening?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. "Is it an earthquake?" "No," Gus said grimly. "It's them." Through the window, they could see the streets of Jericho Hollow beginning to crack and split. Black tendrils of smoke rose from the fissures, twisting and writhing like living things. In the distance, the church bell tower loomed, its shadow stretching impossibly far across the town. Cutter gritted his teeth, his mind racing. They'd destroyed the bell, but it wasn't enough. Whatever had been awakened was still out there, still hungry. "We need to figure out how to stop this," he said, his voice firm, despite the rising panic in his chest. "There's got to be something. Something in the old records, the church archives, anything." Mary looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "You're talking about going back up there? After what just happened?" "If we don't, there won't be a town left," Cutter said. "This thing started with the church, and it's gonna end there too." Outside, the roar grew louder, shaking the very foundations of the house. The group exchanged tense glances, the weight of their decision pressing down on them like a physical force. They had no choice. If they didn't act, Jericho Hollow would be consumed by whatever darkness had been unleashed. With one last glance out the window, Cutter tightened his grip on his flashlight. "Let's move." The night seemed darker than it had any right to be, as if the shadows of Jericho Hollow had grown heavier, more deliberate. The air itself felt alive, humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration that set teeth on edge. Sheriff Cutter and his ragtag group of survivors made their way through the broken streets, each step weighed down by an unspoken sense of doom. The fissures that had opened in the ground earlier had grown, stretching like veins toward the center of town. From their depths emanated a faint, sulfurous stench that clung to the air, thick and choking. The black smoke that writhed within the cracks seemed almost sentient, coiling upward before dissipating into the cold night. It was a quiet kind of malevolence, the kind that gnawed at the mind and made the heart race without reason. Cutter led the way, his flashlight cutting a feeble path through the darkness. Behind him, Gus gripped his lantern, the flickering light casting eerie shadows over his weathered face. Mary and Tom followed closely, the former clutching her rifle with white-knuckled hands, while the latter carried his revolver, with the unease of someone who knew it wouldn't make a difference. And then there was Old Man Harris. The frail, haunted figure shuffled along at the rear, his eyes vacant and his steps unsteady. Harris hadn't said a word since they left his house, but the way his head occasionally jerked toward unseen movements in the dark set everyone on edge. By the time they reached the base of the hill, the church loomed above them like a specter. The building seemed taller than it had earlier, its bell tower piercing the night sky like a dagger. The windows were black and lifeless, and yet Cutter couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from within. "We shouldn't be here," Tom muttered, his voice barely audible. "This place, it's not right." "No argument there," Gus said, hefting his pickaxe. "But running isn't going to help us now." Cutter stopped at the bottom of the church steps and turned to face the group. "We stick together, no matter what," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, we don't split up. If anyone hears or sees anything, don't follow it. Got it?" Mary nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. Tom looked like he wanted to argue but bit his tongue. Harris, as usual, said nothing. With a deep breath, Cutter pushed the heavy doors open. The interior of the church was somehow worse than before. The destruction of the bell had left a gaping hole in the floor where the shards of metal still lay scattered. But the sense of emptiness was gone. Instead, the air felt thick, almost viscous, as if they were wading through an invisible fog. The carvings that had once adorned the bell now seemed to have spread to the walls, faint outlines glowing in the stone like scars. They twisted and spiraled, forming intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, malevolent energy. The coal dust that had once been confined to the altar now coated nearly every surface, a fine black powder that seemed to shift and writhe of its own accord. "What the hell is this?" Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's growing," Gus said grimly, his lantern casting strange shadows over the carvings. "Spreading like a disease." "Or a root system," Cutter muttered, his eyes scanning the room. "The mine shafts beneath the church. This thing is feeding off them, spreading through the veins of coal." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The bell had been a beacon, a call to whatever lay dormant beneath Jericho Hollow. But destroying it hadn't stopped the infection. It had only severed one limb of a creature that was far larger, far older than they had imagined. They moved cautiously through the nave, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of coal dust. The floor groaned beneath their weight, the wood warped and brittle. At the far end of the room, the altar stood like a sentinel, its surface marred by the same glowing carvings that adorned the walls. As they approached, Harris suddenly stopped, his head snapping to the side. His eyes widened, and for the first time since they'd found him, he spoke. "They're here," he whispered. Before anyone could react, the floor beneath them shook violently, a deep guttural roar reverberating through the church. The fissures that had spread through the town seemed to converge here, cracks splintering across the floor like a spider's web. Black smoke began to seep upward, swirling around their feet. "Get back!" Cutter shouted, grabbing Harris by the arm and pulling him away from the altar. But it was too late. The ground beneath the altar erupted, a geyser of coal dust and smoke spewing into the air. From the darkness emerged something massive and grotesque, a shifting, amorphous mass of shadow and ash that defied comprehension. Its form was constantly in flux, tendrils of darkness writhing and coiling, like the limbs of some ancient otherworldly creature. The carvings on the walls flared to life, their light blinding and searing. The air was filled with a deafening cacophony of whispers and screams, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made Cutter's ears ring. Mary screamed, raising her rifle and firing blindly into the mass. The bullets passed through harmlessly, the creature absorbing them like water. Gus swung his pickaxe, the metal glinting in the flickering light, but it too was useless. The tendrils lashed out, striking the ground inches from his feet. "Run!" Cutter bellowed, his voice barely audible over the din. "Get out of here!" The group stumbled toward the doors, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Harris lagged behind, his frail body no match for the chaos around him. One of the tendrils snaked toward him, wrapping around his leg and pulling him to the ground. "Help me!" he cried, his voice filled with terror. Cutter turned back, his heart pounding. Without thinking, he lunged toward Harris, grabbing him by the arm and pulling with all his strength. The tendril tightened, the black smoke seeping into Harris's skin, but Cutter didn't let go. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice raw. With a final desperate yank, Cutter freed Harris from the creature's grasp. The old man collapsed against him, coughing violently, as black streaks spread across his skin like veins. Cutter didn't have time to dwell on it. They needed to get out. They burst through the church doors and into the cold night. the roar of the creature still echoing behind them. The tendrils didn't follow, but the black smoke seeped through the cracks in the walls, spreading into the air like a toxic fog. "Is everyone okay?" Cutter asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mary nodded, though tears streaked her soot-covered face. Gus leaned heavily on his pickaxe, his shoulders heaving. Tom was pale, his revolver hanging limply at his side. Harris was the worst off, his body trembling as the black veins continued to spread beneath his skin. "What the hell do we do now?" Gus asked, his voice filled with despair. "That thing, it's too big, too strong." Cutter stared at the church, his mind racing. The carvings, the bell, the coal dust, it all pointed to one thing. The creature wasn't just in the church, it was in the mine. "We go down," he said grimly. "We end this at the source." The mine loomed before them like the mouth of a beast, wide and hungry, exhaling cold, damp air that stank of sulfur and decay. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot when the coal veins dried up. But tonight, it pulsed with a terrible life. The black tendrils of smoke they'd seen in the church emanated from its entrance, twisting and curling as if beckoning them inside. Sheriff Cutter stood at the edge of the mine shaft, gripping his flashlight tightly. His jaw was clenched, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but his resolve was unshaken. Beside him, Gus Wheeler held his pickaxe like a lifeline, his knuckles white. Mary Danvers stood next to Gus, her rifle slung across her chest. She'd stopped shaking, though her eyes darted nervously to the mine entrance. Tom Fletcher trailed behind, his revolver dangling at his side, while Old Man Harris leaned against a wooden support beam, his face ashen and slick with sweat. The black veins that had appeared on his skin continued to spread, spidering up his neck and into his jawline. "We don't have to do this," Tom said, his voice trembling. "We can leave, get in the truck and drive as far as we can. Whatever's down there, it's not our problem anymore." Cutter turned to him, his expression hard. "And what happens when it follows us? When it spreads to the next town? Or the one after that? You saw what it did to Jericho Hollow. We don't stop it here. It'll never stop." Tom opened his mouth to argue but closed it again, his shoulders sagging. He knew Cutter was right, but that didn't make the thought of stepping into that black abyss any easier to stomach. The descent was slow and suffocating. The mine shaft was steep, the wooden beams supporting the tunnel creaking ominously with every step. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the dampness clinging to their skin and seeping into their bones. The glow from Gus's lantern cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, while the carvings, those strange, ancient symbols, reappeared, etched into the stone like warnings from some long-forgotten age. Mary was the first to notice the sound, a faint rhythmic thudding, like the beating of a massive otherworldly heart. It reverberated through the tunnel, growing louder with every step they took. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We all do," Gus muttered, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Question is, do we really want to find out what's making it?" No one answered. The deeper they went, the more the sound seemed to burrow into their skulls, a pulsing, insistent rhythm that matched their quickening heartbeats. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive cavern, its walls glistening with moisture and veins of coal. At its center stood a jagged pit, blacker than anything Cutter had ever seen. The tendrils of smoke they'd followed snaked down into it, disappearing into its depths. Around the pit, the carvings glowed faintly, their light reflecting off the cavern walls in strange, shifting patterns. The beating sound was deafening now, each pulse shaking the ground beneath their feet. Cutter stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the pit's edge. He peered down, but the darkness swallowed the beam, leaving only an oppressive void. "This is it," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is where it's coming from." "What the hell do we do now?" Mary asked, her voice tight with fear. "We can't shoot it, can't fight it. How are we supposed to stop this thing?" "We collapse the mine," Gus said, his voice grim. He held up a bundle of dynamite, the fuses frayed but intact. "It's the only way. We bring the whole damn place down on top of it." "And us with it," Tom said bitterly. "You really think we're walking out of here after lighting that?" "Maybe not," Gus admitted. "But better us than every poor bastard in Jericho Hollow." As they prepared the dynamite, the cavern seemed to grow colder, the pulsing sound faster, more frantic. The black smoke began to coalesce, swirling together until it formed a massive hulking figure. Its shape was undefined, constantly shifting, but its presence was undeniable. It loomed over them, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats. The creature didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its power radiating through the cavern like waves of heat. It didn't need to speak. Its intent was clear. This was its domain, and they were trespassers. "Keep working," Cutter whispered, his voice shaking. "Don't stop." Gus fumbled with the dynamite, his hands trembling as he tied the fuses together. Mary stood guard, her rifle trained on the creature, though she knew it was useless. Harris stood back, his breathing shallow, the black veins now reaching his eyes. Tom knelt beside Gus, trying to steady his hands. As the first stick of dynamite was placed, the creature moved. Its massive tendrils lashed out, striking the ground with enough force to send shockwaves through the cavern. The group scattered, scrambling to avoid the deadly appendages. Gus dropped the lantern, the light snuffing out as it shattered on the ground. In the chaos, Harris stepped forward, his face twisted in pain and determination. "It's me you want," he said, his voice echoing through the cavern. "I'm the one it called. Take me, and let them go." "No!" Cutter shouted, but it was too late. The creature's tendrils wrapped around Harris, lifting him off the ground. His body convulsed as the smoke enveloped him, the black veins glowing like molten metal. For a moment, he seemed to resist, his eyes meeting Cutter's with a mixture of fear and resignation. Then, with a final shuddering breath, he was gone, pulled into the pit. "Light it!" Cutter yelled, his voice raw. "Now!" Gus struck a match, his hands steady, despite the tears streaming down his face. The fuse caught, sparks dancing along its length as it burned toward the dynamite. The group scrambled for the tunnel, the roar of the creature and the crackling of the fuse merging into a cacophony of sound. As they reached the tunnel entrance, the first explosion rocked the cavern. The ground shook violently, chunks of rock and coal raining down from above. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form twisting and writhing as the walls began to collapse. "Keep moving," Cutter shouted, pushing Mary ahead of him as they stumbled through the narrow passage. As they reached the tunnel entrance, the first explosion rocked the cavern. The ground shook violently, chunks of rock and coal raining down from above. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form twisting and writhing as the walls began to collapse. "Keep moving," Cutter shouted, pushing Mary ahead of him as they stumbled through the narrow passage. The tunnel groaned under the pressure, wooden beams splintering as the weight of the earth above began to crush down. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding them as they scrambled for the surface. Behind them, the explosions continued to echo, each one louder than the last. The ground beneath their feet seemed to rise and fall like the ocean, threatening to throw them off balance. Gus fell to his knees, coughing violently, as the dust filled his lungs. "Come on!" Mary yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. "We're almost there." The light of the surface was just ahead, a faint, flickering beacon in the suffocating darkness. Cutter pushed Tom forward, urging him to keep moving, even as the ground buckled and split beneath their feet. "Go! Go!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the collapsing mine. They burst out of the entrance just as the final explosion tore through the cavern. A massive plume of black smoke and debris erupted from the shaft, rising into the night sky like a volcanic eruption. The ground shook one last time, and then there was silence. Cutter collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he gulped down fresh air. Mary and Gus stood beside him, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their eyes wide with disbelief. Tom sat a few feet away, staring blankly at the smoking remains of the mine. "It's over," Gus said, his voice hoarse. "It's finally over." Cutter wasn't so sure. The silence felt too heavy, too unnatural. He stared at the mine shaft, now little more than a smoking crater, and felt a chill run down his spine. Had they truly stopped it? Or had they only delayed the inevitable? Mary broke the silence, her voice trembling. "What about Harris?" Cutter shook his head, his throat tightening. He knew what he was doing. He saved us. They all fell silent, the weight of Harris's sacrifice settling over them. The old man had been a broken shell when they'd found him, consumed by guilt and fear. But in the end, he'd found the strength to face the darkness. Cutter could only hope that it had been enough. As the hours passed, the group made their way back to town, their steps heavy with exhaustion. The streets of Jericho Hollow were eerily quiet, the black smoke that had plagued the town now gone. The carvings on the buildings had faded, leaving only faint scars in the stone. The church stood in ruins, its bell tower reduced to rubble. The place that had once been the heart of the town was now nothing more than an empty shell, its power broken. But Cutter couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The mine was gone, the creature buried beneath tons of rock and earth, but the memory of its presence remained. It was a scar on the town, one that would never fully heal. "Do you think it's really over?" Mary asked as they stood at the edge of the churchyard, staring at the rubble. Cutter didn't answer. He didn't know. All he could do was hope. In the days that followed, the surviving townsfolk began to rebuild, but the shadow of the mine lingered. Some spoke of leaving Jericho Hollow for good, abandoning the town to its ghosts. Others clung stubbornly to their homes, refusing to let the darkness drive them away. Cutter stayed, his duty to the town stronger than his fear. He patrolled the streets, keeping watch for any signs of the creature's return, though he prayed he would never see it again. And then, one night, as the clock struck midnight, he heard it. The faint echoing toll of a bell. Far away, deep beneath the earth.